Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is 8 Tales of Terror. Now, this is a collection of 8 stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, the stories themselves were, of course, published in the 19th century. However, this particular collection was first published in 1961, and then was republished in 1978. Now, most if not all of Edgar Allan Poe's stories are now in the public domain, so all the stories that are contained in this collection you could probably find in just about 100 different collections. But the stories contained in this collection are the Cask of Amontillado, Hop Frog, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, Ligeia or Ligeia, I'm not really sure how to say the name of that story, The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, The Masque of the Red Death, and The Imp of the Perverse. Now, I actually recorded reviews on each of these stories with my friend Chris last night, but he didn't want to be on camera, so we just recorded audio on my iPhone, so there are some audio problems, but here is me and my friend Chris's review on the Cask of Amontillado. Now, keep in mind, during the review, Chris was pronouncing it a different way, and I'm not sure which one of us was pronouncing it the correct way, and also there are some spoilers in our review of the Cask of Amontillado, but it's a story that's well over 100 years old.
So the first one we're going to talk about is Cask of Amontillado, which was published 1846 in Godey's Lady book. Very interesting, because it's cool that all the great stories we have now, a lot of them came from periodicals, like Sherlock came from Strand magazine, and so on and so forth. A lot of the H.G. Wells and Jules Verne stuff too. Cask of Amontillado is I view it as a psychological thriller, because it's basically a sociopath telling you how he got away with something, but it also qualifies as a revenge story. This dude Montresor, he's very pissed at I never pronounced the dude's name right, the guy in the Jester.
Fortunato is how I pronounced it.
I was like Fortuno for some reason, even though it's very clearly spelled a different way. He's very pissed at Fortuno because he feels he's been slighted in some way. We never find out what he did that pissed him off, which is even more frightening, because he could be full of shit.
Yeah, I've always got the impression that it was over something very petty.
Exactly.
Which kind of makes the story more terrifying, that this guy would just do that to this poor person over something so freaking stupid.
And I think the thing that's scary about this one is Montresor talks to us as though he's a very good friend of ours. So like we've known this guy for ages, like in the context of the story, but he's just now telling us that he's killed somebody. And not only that, he got away with it ages ago, because by the end of the story, Fortunato's been dead like a decade or something like that. But he's very pissed at Fortunato for reasons that could be horseshit. So right out of the gate, we know, like, okay, he's an unreliable narrator. We're not really dealing with somebody who's sane here. So what he does is, in the middle of like a parade festival type thing, he gets Fortunato, who is dressed as a clown gesture, to come down to his catacombs.
Wine cellar.
Yeah, he's got. Well, he claims that he has a wine cellar like beyond catacombs in his basement, where like his family is buried. Mm-hmm. And basically, he's gonna chain him down there and cement him into a cavern, under the pretense that he's got very rare cask of sherry down there, Amontillado. And basically Fortunato can go down there and drink his ass off on the best wine anybody has. So basically the plan goes off without a hitch. He brings him down there, and it's not until I think probably he's putting in the last brick that Fortunato finally becomes conscious enough to realize he's about to get chained into like a little catacomb, and he's basically fucked. And the last thing he shouts, I think, is "For the love of God, Montresor." Like that last moment, like we was like, "You're really gonna fucking kill me?" Like this is how it ends. And I think Montresor goes, "Yeah, for the love of God," and then he puts the last brick in place. And there's this really, really creepy moment where, if I'm remembering this right, he goes, "I felt a chill in that moment, and then I wrote it off as the dampness of the catacombs." So it's almost like him knowing, like, I knew this was wrong, but I just wrote it off because I'm an asshole. And then, it culminates with him going, "Yeah, this happened like 10 years ago, and I got away with it, and I don't feel bad at all, or at least I claim not to." So it's very chilling, the idea of somebody being so cold and somebody like letting somebody die in a very shitty way over something so petty. But it's kind of a fascinating psychological explanation. It kind of reminds me of like Jim Thompson novels, like Killer Beside Me and stuff. Like people who do these really terrible things just without conscience, and the weird kind of insight you're getting into their psychological profile and kind of the way that they are motivated to do terrible things. But I think with Poe, it's all, I think, first and foremost about the vibe and the dread and the terror of it. So the idea that you're sitting with your good friend and he goes, oh yeah, by the way, I killed somebody like a long time ago, and there's actually not really a reason for me to be telling you this. I just felt like telling you that this happened. Yeah, it's so engaging in a weird way, in a scary way, where you kind of question why you're so interested in it. Because I remember I used to have the New Illustrated Classics collection of Poe, and I think the first story was Telltale Heart, and then I went into Amontillado. And the two stories kind of, they bounce off each other in a really cool way, because like Telltale Heart, I think for me was about psychopathy, because that dude was nuts. He literally killed an old man just because he had a funky eye. And then this one is a dude killing somebody because he's telling you, whoa, he pissed me off. Well, why did he piss you off? Oh, well, that's none of your business. Like, that's my fucking business. Shut up, you know? So those two stories are like kind of two sides of a coin in a really interesting way. Like, one is about a crazy dude. One is about a dude who's subtly crazy and knows how to, like, manipulate and fuck with people and is capable of doing a lot of messed up shit, despite the fact that he seems outwardly normal.
I really did feel bad for Fortunato at the end of it. Like,
the phrase you hear a lot of people say is, I wouldn't be caught dead wearing that, and the dude literally dies dressed like a clown.
Yeah.
I mean, the good news is nobody's going to see him, but, like, it's like the shittiest way. Like, you're sort of buried alive and dressed as a clown. Like, not only are you fucked, you're also very uncomfortable.
Now, this story had a comic book adaptation in 1951 titled Blood Red Wine, which was published in an issue of Crime Suspense Stories, which was an anthology comic book series from EC Comics, which is the same comic book company that published the Tales from the Crypt comics. I've never read this version of the story. Have you ever read that?
I had no idea, but it makes a lot of sense because EC Comics would mine so much different like literature for stories. But it makes a lot of sense because that was like a crime book with, you know, the old EC Comics style where it was like very bright colors, everything was very flashy, and this would be a very early example of a crime story. Which, you know, he really was innovative with his stuff. So that makes perfect sense, and I really want to read that now.
And in 1962, there was an anthology horror film directed by Roger Corman called Tales of Terror, which was also written by Richard Matheson and starred Vincent Price. It was part of a series of films that Roger Corman, Richard Matheson, and Vincent Price all worked on together that were based on Edgar Allan Poe stories. But Tales of Terror was 3 Edgar Allan Poe stories adapted into 3 segments, and the second segment was actually an adaptation of The Black Cat, but it incorporated elements from this story into it, where Montresor and Fortunato are the 2 main characters of the story, and Peter Lorre played Montresor and Vincent Price played Fortunato. Have you ever seen Tales of Terror?
Nah, but knowing it now, I have to see that. Wait, Vincent Price was Fortunato?
Yeah.
Was he in the jester costume?
No, he wasn't.
I was about to say, I was like, I need to see that just to see Vincent Price in a clown outfit.
No, but it's a good movie. It's honestly my favorite of all the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations.
That's high praise. I gotta check that out, though.
But in speaking of Vincent Price, he did actually recite this story in a 1970 film called An Evening of Edgar Allan Poe, which was, I haven't seen the whole thing, but it is on YouTube. It's basically Vincent Price on stage, sort of reenacting these different Edgar Allan Poe stories, and this story is one of them.
It sounds like gold. It's really amazing. If you, this is kind of going on a tangent. If you want to hear a really cool recitation of Poe stories, John Aston Gomez from The Addams Family, he did The Raven.
Okay.
And it was dressed as Poe too, and he was kind of like reciting it to the camera. So he was like somewhere like a cross between Gomez and Poe in the video. That's a really cool thing to check out. If it should be on YouTube, I think. So.
And apparently this was adapted into an episode of The Night Gallery. I've never actually seen that episode.
That sounds amazing.
Honestly, I've only seen, like, maybe 1 or 2 Night Gallery episodes. I know it was basically, like, that was, like, Rod Serling's follow-up to The Twilight Zone.
A very underrated follow-up, too, because we got a lot of cool stuff out of that show. So there's adaptations, like, good stories, and that was the first time Spielberg ever made anything.
Yeah.
So that was wow. It makes sense that so many anthologies used it, because it's a good it's a good story to try to anthologize.
There's also a 2014 film called Terror, which was adapted from this story. Never saw that. Have you ever seen that or heard of it?
No.
And there have also been several other adaptations of this story that I'm sure we're skipping over. The next story featured in this collection is Hop Frog, which was originally published in 1849 in a magazine called The Flag of Our Union. What do you think of this story before I get into the plot?
I'm intrigued that it was in a magazine called Flag of Our Union, because I wonder if there was like a patriotic feel to that.
I would have to look that up, honestly.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think it's very obviously... The funny thing about his stuff is, like, he claims that he doesn't like the idea of representation in fiction, but definitely this one has some satire to it, because it's all about somebody who's basically like a dancing monkey.
Yeah.
Which he definitely felt like at some point in his life, especially since it's about, like, there's another recurring thing is beautiful women and them, like, either dying or being wronged in some way, and somebody being very pissed about it. And I think he lost 2 women that were really important to him, and they very much, like, kind of informed, like, how he wrote stories, because he was just depressed as fuck.
Some critics have read the story as being sort of Poe's literary revenge against a poet named Elizabeth F. Elliot, who was involved in a public scandal involving Edgar Allan Poe and another poet named Francis Sargent Osgood. Do you know anything about that?
I didn't, no, but it makes a lot of sense that she would throw shade, because you do see writers do that a lot. And it's, personally, I think it's very petty. But it's interesting to see them work it into fiction, like Michael Crichton has done it. I think Stephen King has done it on a few occasions. To do something that's basically a huge satire of, like, having to put up with, like, pretentious horse shit, basically, from people who were probably way fucking dumber than you anyway.
Now, the plot of Hop Frog is it's about a king who's very cruel and extravagant, and he does have a thing for practical jokes, but he has a court jester, deformed dwarf who's nicknamed Hop Frog, and Hop Frog has a friend named, what was the female dwarf's name?
Shit.
It was something with a T, and I know it's gonna, like...
And even if we knew it, I don't think we'd probably be pronouncing it right anyway.
Yeah, I think... I know, like, when I go to edit this video, I'm gonna remember what it is and, like, be calling myself stupid the whole time I'm editing this video. But, yeah, basically, the king, he constantly humiliates Hop Frog, but what's sort of the final straw for him is when he humiliates this female dwarf who is a friend of Hop Frog's, who it's very much implied that they might also be lovers, and basically Hop Frog plans a revenge against the king and his subjects. I don't want to give away what this revenge is, but it's honestly pretty gruesome, and surprisingly gruesome for a story written well over 100 years ago.
Yeah, which is what I was saying earlier, was like it must have freaked the shit out of people, because it's not frightening, but it is like, whoa, like it's
well, it's pretty frightening for that king, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly, for it to be actually been there. But you also see that happen in a lot of different stories now, with like a giant massacre at a gathering, that kind of thing, that just like fucks a lot of people up.
Yeah, it's very much a revenge story like the Cask of Amontillado. Very much a revenge story like that one, but in this story, your sympathies definitely lie with the person getting revenge, whereas in the previous story, Montresor was definitely the villain, whereas here, you could very much argue that Hop Frog is the protagonist.
Yeah, this is the total opposite end of the spectrum, because you sympathize with this dude, and you see where he's coming from, to the point where you kind of, it makes sense that he does all this crazy shit.
Especially when it's implied that he was taken from his home. Yeah.
I just love the ending, because I think it goes like, I'm simply Hop Frog, and that is the end of my story, or something like that. Like, this is me, and this is what I...
Well, he's not really the one narrating it. It's more told from a unnamed narrator.
Right, yeah. But I just loved, like, the feel of, like, this is me, and this is what I had to do.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Like, it's sort of almost like a character piece, which it's kind of unusual for Edgar to do that, because normally it's more just about, okay, here's a messed up situation and here's what happened, and yeah, here's like a creepy, abrupt way to end it, and we'll move on.
And honestly, this might actually be my favorite Edgar Allan Poe story of the ones that I've actually read, because I'll admit I have not read every single thing by him.
That'd be very fucking tough, but no, that's interesting that you find. Why do you think it's your favorite?
I don't know. I think just because I find Hop Frog to be a very compelling character.
Oh, that's cool.
Like, you honestly do genuinely feel bad for him, and as gruesome as his revenge against the king is, you feel like he kind of deserves this.
Yeah. My favorite is one that's actually coming later, but we'll get there. But it's also, I think, an unconventional choice compared to what most people like from him, so...
Now, there was a film adaptation of this story in 1910. However, I'm pretty sure the film's now considered to be lost. I haven't really been able to find anything about the 1910 adaptation of this story. But Roger Corman actually did incorporate some elements of this story in his 1964 adaptation of The Masque of the Red Death.
All right, so now we got manuscript found in a bottle. Which was published 1833 in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. That's a really cool, like, casual name for a magazine. This one is about a guy at sea who is on one vessel that goes under, and then the events after that become very kind of interpretive, or like up for interpretation, or the same thing as Amontillado. We can't really sure he's telling us the truth about what's happening, because perception is different from what actually happened. But basically this huge black freighter comes and picks him up, and then we get a sense that something's not right, and we're not really sure what it is. These guys are trying to get down to the South Pole, and they're really determined to do so, but they kind of all know they're sort of fucked, and they know that they're going to go down. And basically the story ends on a really, like, dour, kind of abrupt note where the whole thing sinks. They get, like, it was like a typhoon or like a whirlpool.
Yeah,
a whirlpool they got sucked into, and everything just sort of stops with, like, the ship is going to go down. But it's interesting because you see him playing around with epistolary, because it's somebody writing all this down and sort of as a play-by-play of what's happening. But there's also kind of some elements where you start wondering, is this meant to be satire or parody? Because it's weird, first off, that we have a more or less complete, like, story of what happened, whereas, like, who the fuck would be making diary entries while all this was going on? So it could be him kind of, like, making jokes about sort of all the seafaring stories that were going on at the time. I don't know in terms of place. You said, what was the date again? It was
1833,
and I think Frankenstein also, like, opens with people at sea. They're trying to make it to Antarctica just kind of for the sake of saying they did. And by the end of that story, he kind of realizes, okay, we should stop fucking around with nature and just go home, because we just heard about this crazy shit that happened, and maybe we ought to just take it to heart. So also it could be, like, just a cautionary tale about not doing things for the sake of doing them. Just, you could say that, you went on this expedition. A movie, this is going on a little bit of a tangent again, but a movie I just saw, I think earlier this week, was Ad Astra, which was all about, human exploration and accomplishment, but kind of ending on a note where you go, are we doing these things genuinely for the betterment of people, or are we doing them to say that we did them? There's kind of a difference between the two, and it's important to know what the difference is. Because, we do sacrifice a lot to make these voyages, and sometimes it might not, the ends might not justify the means. So it's kind of, it's a matter of opinion whether or not it's a straight up cautionary tale, or if it's Poe kind of making fun of what was going on with stories at the time. Another one would be like Journey to the Center of the Earth, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, like all these, like, fantastical depictions of, like, exploration and adventure. So whether or not he's, like, trying to tear that down, or whether he's making fun of him, that's kind of up to whoever's reading it.
Yeah, this is a story that I actually kind of had to read twice in order to really get. I didn't like it the first time I read it. When I read it a second time, I got into it a little bit more because I think I understood it a little bit more. Basically, the main character's kind of... the way I interpret it is he's kind of stuck in this ghostly reenactment of past events, and, possibly this ghost ship is literally going to hell, or it's just basically reenacting the events that led up to the death of all these sailors.
I really like that interpretation, too. It's
yeah. You could see the influence of this story in something like the Black Freighter segments of Alan Moore's Watchmen.
You and I really are on the same level. I was about to bring that up. Yeah, we hadn't even talked about it. But yeah, and the Black Freighter in that story turned out to be a big metaphor for giving into your demons and kind of becoming the very thing you're trying to fight. So it's sort of a universal theme that they got going here. And it's cool to still see that in stories that came out, as much as like a few decades ago.
But yeah, it's a good story. It's not one of my favorite Poe stories, but it's one I enjoy.
I like it a lot, yeah. I think what I just like when stories kind of mess around with structure, and this is like a dude doing a diary entry and all that stuff. I like genre turning stuff like that, so I think it's cool to see him playing around with sort of like literary format. It's interesting to see a classic author do that. It's kind of engaging.
So the next story featured in this collection is Ligeia, or Ligeia. How do you pronounce the name of this story?
I think it's Ligeia.
Okay. We might both be pronouncing it wrong, I'm not sure, but this story was first published in 1838 in the American Museum. But what do you think of this story?
I like it. I mean, my sensibilities go right towards, like, this is an early zombie story. I don't think that's not anyway what he was going for. It's more just kind of...
Technically, it's a zombie. You could say that. I interpret it more as, like, a ghost story or a reincarnation kind of story.
That makes sense, yeah. So, basically, it's just like this... You see the spectral... The beautiful, almost spectral woman kind of pop up again in his stories. Like, this dude is madly in love with this woman. But strangely enough, he doesn't really know too much about her background. He doesn't even like remember too much about her in retrospect. And then when she kind of passes on, he is totally depressed and totally wrecked. But then I think he takes a lot of opium or something.
Yeah.
And basically one night as he's kind of mourning over her, she comes back to life.
Yeah. Well, it's also his he finds a new lover, and she kind of possesses his new lover, if I'm remembering the story correctly.
Right.
Yeah, but keep in mind, it's been a while since I've read this story, so my memory's a little fuzzy on this one.
Mm-hmm. But it's a very frightening moment where somebody who was stone dead a second ago is now up and moving, and there's no real explanation as to why or how. I think one way to look at it is kind of his passion for this woman kind of brings her back for a moment. But it's really just a story about mourning and about kind of that lust for somebody who's gone, and the tragedy that they're gone, and that the dread that they're now gone from the world is never going to go away. The world is always going to be a shitty place without them.
Yeah. And you brought this up earlier, how a lot of Poe's stories are about are basically about a woman who dies and then the woman comes back. You see that in like The Raven, technically, depends on how you want to interpret that.
Fall of the House of Usher. Yeah. Even stuff like Lenore. It's interesting because
Morella is another one.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously it's something that affected him personally, and you see it all through his fiction. It sucks because I think a lot of us have lost loved ones, so it's not even a romantic dread. It's just in general, like, you care about somebody and they're gone, and they really made who you are a lot more enjoyable and a lot more tolerable.
Yeah, this is a good story, but again, it's been a while, so I'm kind of like, I'm definitely... I'm kind of jumping all over the place with this one, but it is a good one. I actually do highly recommend, if you don't want to read this story, because I will say the story is very long. It's actually close to novella length, honestly, but...
Which is weird for him.
Yeah, but I highly recommend looking up... Vincent Price actually recorded an audiobook for this story that is on YouTube. I highly recommend looking that up, because he does a great job with that. Now, this story has been adapted several times. In 1964, Roger Corman did an adaptation of this story called The Tomb of Ligeia, if we're saying the name of the character right, and it was also adapted into a 2008 film called The Tomb. Have you seen either of those adaptations?
No, but I'm not surprised that Corman did another one. Not at all. So now we move on to Fall of the House of Usher, published in 1839 in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. So the basic plot of it is this guy goes to visit his good friend and his sister where they live. This like massive like mansion place, very like dreary on what basically looks like a creepy hilltop. And kind of as this visit goes on, things keep getting sort of creepier and creepier, and he becomes more and more uncomfortable because it's very obvious there's a lot of animosity between the sister and brother. And eventually this culminates in the sister passing away one night, and circumstances that you don't quite understand, and is again sort of up for interpretation. And then that eventually sort of like a domino effect type thing that eventually culminates in
the literal fall of the House of Usher.
The literal fall of the House of Usher. And I think it was like one night he hears the sister's voice coming from the catacombs, and his friend is very, very disturbed and very frightened. And the door flies open, and she's there, and she comes and she grabs him.
Yeah.
And the house starts crumbling down. And the narrator runs out, and he stands in bewilderment like in front of the house, and the whole thing just crumbles down, and he's just like, what just happened? And I love it because I like it when a place is an entity. Yeah. There's something that I find very interesting about that. The idea of a place as a living, almost breathing thing, and that it has tangibility to us. Because we make these places as shells, like when you live in a house, that's sort of your hub.
Yeah.
And the idea that you have some kind of like symbiotic relationship to a place is very interesting, very fascinating, especially when you think of what we're capable of as humans. The idea that your car is an extension of yourself, your house is kind of your sanctum. And the idea that the whole thing would kind of collapse in on itself because a traumatic thing happened, or because, just it's that way when you're not there. Is really fascinating. But I mean, the way that I kind of like to think about it is sort of the relationship between these two is so complex and so weird and so all over the place as your relationship with any close friend or relative is. It literally started to leave its mark on the house they lived in, to the point where the house was conscious enough to perceive what was going on or to be affected by it. So you got to wonder, is her resurrection legit, or is it sort of a phantom kind of like caused by the house almost?
Well, the implication I think you're supposed to get is that she was buried alive, and she clawed her way out of the coffin, but has gone insane because, she was buried alive.
Right. And then it's such a crazy image, like in the middle of the night, all of a sudden someone who was supposedly dead pops up outside your bedroom door.
Yeah.
That's what he did really well, that sense of dread and terror.
Yeah, and something that I think is really interesting about this story is this idea that, okay, so the Usher family has, they've existed for generations, and their house has stood for generations, and you just see how quickly and how easily this thing that has stood for generations just crumbles. Like, I think that's really a really interesting aspect of the story.
It's one of my favorite themes that he does is kind of the inevitability of decay. You see that later on with Masque of Red Death, the idea that nothing is ever going to last forever. Things are going to fall apart, and that's just the way things are, and we have to deal with both the wonder and the horror of that. The idea that this house that's been standing for all that time kind of just went down, and also not really understanding the circumstances of how that even happened. It's interesting, and it's frightening, and it's a cool thing to kind of ruminate on. That's the kind of thing I love out of these types of stories is, let's wonder about the weird shit, and let's really analyze it and think about how we feel about it and how it affects us as people and how we react to it. But yeah, those are my favorite kinds of stories, when you see representations of things done in crazy, fantastical ways. Obviously, later on with Masque of Red Death, you have a plague walking around as a literal person. And now in this, you have a house that kind of represents sort of esteem and generations, and then it all comes down in one fell swoop because of a very toxic relationship between two siblings.
Yeah.
It sort of makes you think about the nature of things and the fact that, you know, we are all gonna die, and it could be under shitty circumstances. It could be because that's just what happened that day.
Yeah.
You know, just because unfortunate shit happens, you know.
But yeah, no, this is a great story, and I totally see why it's considered to be one of Poe's best. I definitely think it's probably his most character-driven story. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because normally his stories are all about kind of plot and theme, whereas I think a lot of storytelling is really, the heart of it is characters and theme, because it's what this story is trying to say, and what the people populating them, you know, what they go through, and you empathizing with them. Whereas a lot of his stories are really just kind of about a crazy situation and what that crazy situation means. Like Montresor and Fortunato, as much as like they are the story of Cask of Amontillado, it never feels, you never properly engage with the two of them, as much as Montresor's kind of mental state is fascinating. But this is like a whole other thing where you're really engaged with this very strange relationship between the two, because I think she might be insane and he doesn't know how to process that. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's one way you could interpret it.
Yeah, so he doesn't really know how to process the fact that his sister is losing her mind,
and he might be losing his mind too.
Yeah, and it's like they're just two fucking lunatics who've been cooped up in this house, and they don't really have proper people skills or know how to respond to things.
Yeah. I also think it's really interesting how the whole movie's kind of told from an outsider's the whole story's told from an outsider's perspective, where it's just this guy who's a friend of Roderick who comes in and he witnesses the decay of this family. I think that's a really fascinating aspect of the story as well.
Right, yeah. And just the idea that sort of, if you think about the house as a microcosm that only they inhabit, when you think about it, your world is what you perceive. And if you never leave a place, that place is your world. So if the two of them, if the house is the world to them, it would make sense that the whole thing would collapse when they died, or when just everything fell apart.
Now, there have been several adaptations of this story. In 1928, there were actually two silent adaptations, a French film and an American film. I've never seen either of these two versions of the story, and this was also adapted again in 1950, and probably the most famous film adaptation of this story is the 1960 film House of Usher from Roger Corman, which was actually written by Richard Matheson and starred Vincent Price as Roderick Usher. Have you seen the Roger Corman adaptation?
No, but I'd really like to, because especially since there's so many good things coming together, like Corman, Matheson, Price, and then doing a Poe story. It's like one of the best productions you could do.
It was actually the first of their Poe movies, which was actually a whole series that Roger Corman did, and honestly, I think it's probably some of Roger Corman's best work.
I can believe it. Did they ever do Pit and the Pendulum?
Yeah, they did Pit and the Pendulum, yeah.
Because that would be like a proto version of Saw, basically.
Yeah.
That's it. I gotta check that out.
But yeah, the Roger Corman adaptation was really good. You can also see the influence of this story in something like Stephen King's The Shining.
Oh yeah, because that was another story about a place being a living, like, corporeal thing and wanting to latch onto people and take it with them. So, and it's really fascinating when you think about things like, you know, objects in space. If anybody catches the reference, the idea of like a place kind of taking on the properties of the people who live within them, you know. And again, the microcosm thing, where like if you perceive the world as a place, that place becomes your world. And, you know, if you never leave a house, that house would be what you see the world as.
Yeah. There's also a book called Usher's Passing by Robert McCammon, which basically plays on this whole idea that what if the Ushers were a real family that have made a deal with the devil, and Poe is just like writing the Fall of the House of Usher as like a story based on them. It's actually a really good book if you haven't read that.
Oh wow, that guy! I keep hearing his stuff recommended. He sounds really interesting. I gotta definitely check out his stuff at some point. But no, that sounds.
Oh, I highly recommend Robert McCammon, especially his books Boy's Life and Swan Song.
Oh wow, okay, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I'll read that as soon as I get a chance.
So the next story featured in this collection is William Wilson, which was first published in 1839 in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. And basically the story's about a man who calls himself William Wilson, even though you never find out if that's actually his real name or not. It kind of implies that he's just using a pseudonym as he writes, but basically you find out that when he was younger in school, there's another student with the same name who bared a striking resemblance to him, and essentially the whole story is really about him being tormented by his doppelganger. That's the basic outline of the plot. But what do you think of William Wilson?
I think it's really great because you see that kind of fascinating sort of storytelling device of a doppelganger becoming your window into yourself. There was an episode of Twilight Zone, I think it was called Mirror Mirror, where a woman goes to a bus stop, and across from her is a woman who looks exactly like her with the same suitcase. And, one thing leads to another. She starts realizing that this is her from like a different dimension or something like that. And recently, Us came out.
Yeah. You could definitely see the influence of this story in Us.
For sure, yeah, because that was the same thing. Like, all right, if you're fighting yourself, what do you know about yourself? And how would you deal with yourself and, try to take down yourself as an enemy? So the idea of like doing two different versions of the same person and having that be sort of a window for insight, it's really good and scary when you think about it. Because what if you looked up and the same, it's you?
Yeah.
Like I think Jordan Peele said it. He was like, imagine you were standing on a subway platform and across on the train going in the other direction is somebody who looks just like you, and they just like smile at you.
Yeah, that would be pretty terrifying.
And they just like, they know something you don't, it's very scary.
What I also think is interesting about this story is the protagonist is not a very likable character at all. He's kind of a dick.
Yeah, which it works well for this because him kind of fighting against his doppelganger makes him, or at least makes you aware that this is not a good person. And he might kind of, the doppelganger might be sort of his comeuppance from all the things that he does.
Now, this story was adapted into a 1913 film called The Student of Prague, which was loosely based on this story, but it also took elements from the Faust legend, and The Student of Prague was remade in 1926, and then it was remade again in 1935, and I think there have been other adaptations of this story as well, and Stephen King actually took a lot of elements from this story for his recent novel, The Outsider. I haven't read The Outsider yet, have you?
I haven't. I keep hearing that lately he's really starting to dip his toes into crime fiction, and that this was like an extension of that. I feel like knowing that it's about a doppelganger is probably a huge spoiler, so sorry about that for people who are listening. But I have a copy of it, but I actually haven't read it yet because it's pretty lengthy. I think it's probably like 600 pages, but I'll check it out when I get the chance. It sounds really, really good.
And as we already pointed out, Jordan Peele's recent film, Us, seems like it might have been based on this story, at least very loosely, or at least inspired by this story. And then the Twilight Zone episode, Mirror Mirror, I mean, you see like the whole idea of doppelgangers come up so many times in horror. And I'm not sure if this was the first story that did that, but
it's definitely an early example, and an early example of it done well too. Yeah.
The next story featured in the collection is The Masque of the Red Death, which was first published in 1842 in Graham's Magazine. And the plot of this story is there's a plague going around called the Red Death, but the story follows a prince who is having a masquerade ball while this is happening, and he doesn't really seem to care what's going on in the outside world. But a mysterious figure comes to the masquerade who could possibly be the Grim Reaper or even the devil himself. He comes comes to punish them for essentially not giving a crap about what's going on with the outside world and all that. I mean, that's the basic plot line of Masque of the Red Death. But what do you think of this story?
Interesting interpretation, by the way. This is actually my personal favorite Poe story, and I think a big reason is because you get that big, broad, theme of the inevitability of death and decay. But also, I love the visuals of it. You have a red room, a black room, a purple room, and there's a room that people are too scared to go into. There's always that room in big places that freaks people out. And the idea of like a big black room at the end of this all that nobody's really in because they're too freaked out just by the ambience of it and like the existence of it. And that's where he eventually ends up cornering it. There's definitely a lot of like sort of subtext going on there about the unknown and what we find in the shadows and that type of thing. But I like if you thinking of it as the Grim Reaper or as death itself, because I always thought about it as like, all right, this thing is the literal personification of the plague. It's literally like a disease come to life, and irritated with the fact that somebody thinks that you can overcome it or you can deal with inevitability.
The way I kind of looked at the story is that it's basically the prince feels he's above all this. Like, exactly. He feels like, it's only the poor people who are being affected by this plague, and he doesn't really, it doesn't tell you what this prince's policies would be politically, but you almost get the idea that he's not doing anything to help, the quote-unquote peasants who are dying of this plague. And again, if you want to interpret the Red Death in the story, the masked figure as being possibly the devil or something, you could interpret it as maybe it's God's punishment on the prince for not caring about the underclass and all that.
It's an intriguing idea, but I don't know if it's necessarily righteous punishment. I think if you think of it like it is basically Versailles, right? Like it's this whole thing reeks of French aristocracy, higher ups who don't give a fuck about people, living in their ivory towers and shit. But then this kind of disease comes that's gonna mess with everybody and does not give a shit about who you are personally or in terms of stature.
Yeah, basically it's this idea that death comes for all of us, no matter what our class is.
We're all equal in death's eyes, is the idea of it. And it's just a scary idea to think of that specter in the crowd, is what I always love. Because it's a masquerade ball. Everybody's already dressed, it's eyes wide shut, right?
Yeah.
As far as the eye can see in this huge place. But just if somebody's paying enough attention, they can see somebody moving through the crowd dressed as somebody who has died from the plague. All in red, covered in blood, that kind of thing. And then finally they go up to confront it, and there's nothing in the costume. And everybody drops dead. It's so frightening and so visceral, and it's, I think, honestly brilliant for the time. Because people reading this must have literally not been able to process it. There's a lot of praise that I could have for it, but I love the symbolism of it, and I think it's done really well for a story of the time.
Now, Roger Corman did an adaptation of this story in 1964. Yeah. I've seen the Roger Corman version, and I do like it, but it's been a while since I've seen it. Our friend Bill, he absolutely loves the Roger Corman version. But what do you think of that one?
I like it because they kept the theme of colors, they heightened it, because at the end of the movie you find out red is a representation of decay, yellow is leprosy, green is gluttony or something, and these are color-coded spectrums that kind of just haunt the world and just kind of fuck us up whenever they get the chance, and we just have to deal with the fact that they exist. But you also get the character study, because Prospero, the prince, who's very suspiciously named after the wizard from The Tempest, I like that they kind of analyzed him as a character, with Vincent Price playing him too, which is awesome. And that kind of moment at the end where instead of there being nothing under the costume, they change it to he sees himself under the costume, and which a little bit of William Wilson in there, because he's looking at a fucked up version of himself who says to him, "You shouldn't be afraid to die, because your soul's always been dead." And then they all drop dead. It's very freaky.
Yeah, and there was a 1989 adaptation, but I've never seen that version.
I've never even heard of it. Yeah, I'm sure it was interesting, because I think it's tough to do this story in a way that wouldn't be visually fascinating, because with all the color-coded rooms and all that stuff.
Honestly, I'm almost surprised, now you mentioned colors, I'm surprised Dario Argento never tried to adapt this story.
That's a good, because Suspiria, I mean, that's like, watching that movie is such a great visual experience, and it's really weird that he wouldn't, like, jump right at this.
Now, the story has been referenced many times in different literary works, most notably Gaston Leroux's book, The Phantom of the Opera, where there's a scene where Eric appears at a masquerade dressed as the Red Death, and that scene was famously adapted in the 1925 adaptation of Phantom of the Opera. Have you read Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera?
I've read the book. I've seen multiple versions of the movie. I like the musical. That's like one of my all-time favorites. I think I read Phantom when I was something like 8 years old, and he's still like one of my all-time favorite characters, and it's a weird, cool, like, symbiosis thing, because Red Death is my favorite Poe story. He shows up at one point dressed as Red Death, so it's kind of a cool, like, nerd thing for him. It's cool to think that, like, that movie innovated so much. Movie makeup, color, because people flipped their shit when they saw Lon Chaney as Eric, as he takes the mask off him. It's a very frightening moment. People, like, fainted and shit. Yeah,
it was basically The Exorcist of its time.
Exactly, yeah. It made grown men question, how big their dicks are, So it was...
Well, I didn't know it did that to people. Lon Chaney was a sexy man, so...
It's incredible, like, to think what that movie did in retrospect. But yeah, Gaston obviously was a Poe fan, so to have him turn up as Red Death at a masquerade, no less, there's a lot of great symbolism there. But the character of the Phantom, he's so culturally relevant. You can tell he's a dude who would be a Poe fan, and most likely was meant to be, because he shows up dressed as a specter from one of the stories.
The story was also referenced a lot in Stephen King's The Shining.
Which makes a lot of sense, because huge place, everybody's walled off from society, so for a brief period of time, this is going to be your world.
Yeah.
And you're not really sure if you're ever going to get out, or if everything's going to change, but you have to make do with what you are, and then everything's going to go to shit, because there's spooky shit going on, and, it's something you have to face head on, otherwise it's going to destroy you. In this, you see it destroy them because they're arrogant, and they refuse to believe that anything could affect them in this walled-off place. In The Shining, you see it take out Jack because he's susceptible to it. He's mildly insane. He's also a drunk, and the ghosts, depending on which interpretation you take, the ghosts either figure out how to fuck with him, or his mind takes over, and he comes under the impression that the place is haunted, and all this crazy shit is going on. It's kind of variations on the same theme. Like, what if a place was alive to some degree, and some crazy shit's gonna go down. So the last one we're doing is The Imp of the Perverse, which was published in 1845 in Graham's Magazine, and this one is pretty straightforward. I kind of appreciate the broad symbolism of it. Like, the Imp of the Perverse is really just a metaphor for the voice in the back of your head that tells you to do fucked up shit, and probably against your best interest, but doing it also just for the sake of doing it. A guy at one point, sort of in the back of his head is thinking, what if you jumped off a cliff? And eventually it causes him to commit a murder. And he ultimately just blames this id in the back of his head that he just could not listen to. But part of me makes it wonder if maybe it was meant to be sort of an indictment of people who don't take responsibility for their own actions. As much as I think Poe was really good about talking about the things that kind of make us do what we do, it also seems like he might have had some outrage about people who just kind of are dicks and don't want to fess up to it. But it's such a familiar trope, because we all have to think about, like, the devil angel on the shoulder. One guy's telling us good ideas, one guy's telling us bad ideas. Sometimes we listen to one, sometimes we listen to the other. But also, and this just comes from my personal philosophy, there's times where you have to do a bad thing. There's times where you want to do the right thing, but it's just not gonna work. It's morality is kind of a testy thing at that point. So when it comes to the Imp of Perverse, that idea of the bad side of you given a voice, it's a scary thought to think that maybe it's something you can't control, even though it is a part of yourself. And you see it now with, like, comic book adaptations. You take something like, one of my all-time favorite, I think probably actually my all-time favorite comic book villain is the Green Goblin. And that's all about the id. Norman is a sort of a very greedy, very ambitious dude who continually gives into his lesser impulses about, like harming people or, stealing, committing murder, that kind of thing. And the idea, there is a weird tangibility to it because he turns both psychologically and literally into a goblin, which I guess if you talk about monsters could also be an extension of an imp, like a freaky demon thing. So really it's just a parable about why we have those bad impulses and whether or not we are capable of ignoring them, or whether or not they control us, or they're the true us but just hiding behind, sort of the veil of morality. I think that's what I like the most about these kinds of stories, is there's so much you can take away from it and so much you can reinterpret and think of as just what it's trying to say to you or what you get out of it.
Yeah. And you kind of took a lot more from this story than I did. Honestly, this was probably my least favorite story in this particular collection, and probably my least favorite Poe story out of the Poe stories I've actually read. Again, that's just my opinion, and maybe if I read the story again, I might reevaluate it. Who knows? I have another collection of Poe stories that... Actually, no, the one I have doesn't have this story, surprisingly. It's one from Barnes & Noble Classics, The Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think this one's contained in that one, but I'm assuming it's in your collection.
Yeah, I have like a giant leather-bound dictionary-sized one that's everything he ever wrote. And that's from Barnes & Noble, too, ironically. They're one of those nice, snazzy classics editions. But admittedly, like, I guess it does drag a lot. It's weird how you feel about a story depending on like how you feel about theme, prose, whatever. But I mean, different people get different things out of stories, and for me, I appreciate kind of the symbolism of it and the idea of it.
Oh, I can appreciate that. Again, it's a story that I might need to read again and maybe reevaluate. If I ever get another Poe collection that has this story in it, maybe I'll review that, and maybe then I'll have a different opinion on the story. But for now, I can honestly say this is probably my least favorite Poe story. So that was our review on the 8 stories contained in the collection 8 Tales of Terror. Now, since pretty much all of Poe's stories are in the public domain, there are probably hundreds of different Poe collections out there, so chances are, even if you don't have this collection, you probably have another Poe collection that has any one of these stories in it. But Chris, even though you didn't read the stories from this particular collection, what do you think of this particular grouping of Poe stories?
I think it makes sense because you got 3 of them that are like the well-known ones, which is Amontillado, House of Usher, and then Red Death, and then you get these kind of 4 sort of like lesser-known, very different kind of Poe stories. So I think it's sort of an easy kind of indoctrination type thing. Like, all right, here's what you know from him, and here's like some lesser known stuff, and like an easier way to digest things you may not know he has written. But I definitely like manuscript found in a bottle in particular. I think is very cool because you see him playing around with like how a story is told, and a lot of these old stories were always a friend of the person this happened to is being told the story. That was how Frankenstein was done. Dracula was entirely epistolary. It was always like people writing down something that happened earlier. So I think that's really cool as you see him like playing around throughout these stories with how stories are told. And I think the fact that it was these 8 specifically brought together, I think that was the focus of the collection, was to kind of have you see the different ways that Edgar would write stuff down, rather than have them all be kind of collected because they were similar in plot or similar in theme or whatever. This one seems more geared towards like, all right, if you're curious about how Edgar messed around as a writer, this is what you should check out. Because Telltale Heart is fairly straightforward, something like that. Raven is fairly straightforward because that's basically almost like a poem that a person is just telling you about, Whereas a bunch of this is, some of it's third person, some of it is like a letter, some of it is epistolary, some of it is a person being told a story that somebody else is telling them. It's, there's a cool diversity to it.
Real quick, any words on like Poe's influence on pop culture?
You still see it today everywhere. I was watching, there was a show with Nathan Fillion a while ago called Castle, and it's about a guy who is a writer of like crime fiction, and you find out, I think it was in like season 2, that Richard Castle is not his real name. His birth name is Richard Rogers, but the middle name of his stage name is Edgar, for Edgar Poe. So I mean, the fact that was a show that was on like 10 years ago, and people are still making references to this guy's work. And there was a Halloween episode where he dressed as Poe too.
All right.
It was pretty good. So yeah, I mean, it's an influence that has been so withstanding for a long time, and I think will go on for a very long time. All over horror stuff, not even necessarily, even like romance stories about like losing your loved one. You know, it's the Lenore was that. You know, the Raven was that.
Yeah,
it's pretty universal. It doesn't even necessarily have to be horror.
So that was our review on the Edgar Allan Poe collection, 8 Tales of Terror. I do recommend getting this collection, but once again, the stories that are contained in here are probably available in almost any other Edgar Allan Poe collection, so I recommend checking these stories out. And if you don't want to read them, since they're all public domain, you could find audiobooks of these stories easily on YouTube.
And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.